Ihr Kreisky.
Herzlichen Glückwunsch zu noch einem Gespräch aus Kreiskys Wohnzimmer. Heute mit Michael Ignatieff und sein Buch On Consolation. Dieses Gespräch ist auf Englisch und wir schalten jetzt sozusagen. Michael Ignatieff, welcome and thank you for being our guest here. You've written a book on very possibly the least fashionable philosophical subject there is. Tell us why.
Philip, it began by accident. I was invited to a choral concert in Utrecht in the Netherlands, at which all 150 settings of the Psalms were going to be sung. And I sat with my wife in a huge concert hall in Utrecht and listened to 4 wonderful choirs sing the Psalms. And I was very, very struck by the reaction across the whole audience. The words of the Psalms were projected in Dutch and English over the hall. The choirs were resonant and beautiful. And the effect was deeply cathartic to everybody who was there. It was a very emotional weekend. And I found myself thinking, why are we so comforted by this ancient language? Why is it that we are comforted despite the fact that many of us don't believe the salvation or believe in the God that the Psalms promises? So that's how it started. Why are non-religious people consoled by or comforted by rituals, language, music written for a religious purpose? And then I just followed my nose, Philip. It just went on and on. I got interested in consolation for another reason, which is that it takes us to the limits of language. It's one of the most important things that any of us ever do. If you have to console someone, you know it's terribly hard to find words when someone's lost someone they love. It's terribly hard to be truthful in those situations. It's terribly hard to show empathy in those situations. It's a very difficult moment. But if we didn't do consolation as best we could, we'd feel very badly about ourselves. So it's a very important moment. Why is it so difficult to console others? Why is it so difficult to console ourselves? These were the questions that got me going.
Well, I mean, that gets us right into the middle of the discussion. Why is it so difficult? We live in societies where something like consolation either no longer plays a role at all or has been professionalized.
Yeah.
If you're in need of consolation, it's a sort of market failure, and there are professionals that you can turn to who will sort you out again.
Yeah.
That's not what you mean.
No. Yeah, modern psychology and modern psychoanalysis encourages us to think of loss and failure and the death of loved ones as kind of an illness for which we need therapy, or we need drugs, or we need counseling.
You're just a bit dysfunctional.
Yeah, consolation is a much older tradition which thinks of suffering very differently, not as an illness, but as just part of the human experience, and a part of the human experience in which we have an opportunity to display our virtues, the virtues of sympathy, the virtues of comfort, the virtues of love, and also the virtues of endurance and resilience. So it's a very old and different tradition. It's not a tradition that the 20th century has much time for, which is precisely why I went back to it, because I thought, frankly, Philip, we need all the help we can get here, I mean, I don't want to disparage therapy, certainly not in Vienna, right? I've had therapy myself.
A hazardous thing to do, yes.
I've had therapy myself. It's helped me through some difficult times. But I wanted to get back to these older traditions because I think it's lost wisdom and we can't afford to lose wisdom.
Why did we lose that wisdom? I mean, I don't want to go back to this sort of idealization of traditional wisdom, but it's certainly we are societies that have great difficulties of coping with states like this. We like to farm them out, compartmentalize them away. We are societies of winners.
Yeah.
We are societies of transformative ambition. Is it so difficult for us to accept the bottom line defeat that precedes consolation?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, let me give you a little story about that struck me very much. It's a Canadian story, but Canadian women's hockey, we're the best in the world. 4 years ago at the Olympics, the Canadian women's team lost. It was inconceivable to lose, but it was even worse to lose to the bloody Americans. So in the medal ceremony, the Canadians were given silver medals. It was the first time a Canadian women's team had ever got a silver medal. And one of the women refused to wear the silver medal. And she left the stage. And the Olympic Committee said, "Excuse me, you don't understand the rules here. Part of the rules of Olympic sportsmanship are that you accept the consolation prize, which is the silver medal. You have to come out and go through this ritual of being a good loser." All this story brings home some of these issues. I mean, you know, there's a famous, to continue the sporting metaphor, there's a famous American football coach who said, you know, "Show me a good loser and I'll show you a loser." Our culture is very built on these ideas. It's deep in me. I mean, I'm extremely standardly, conventionally ambitious North American. But this cult of success, this cult of achievement, is both Promethean. I mean, it's admirable in some way. It means that we produce a lot of wonderful things. But it leaves us absolutely defenseless when we fail, when we come up short. And then we do have to console ourselves. And we say a lot of things to ourselves which are, frankly, problematic. We say things like, "I gave it my best shot. I tried. I left nothing on the table," you know. And then in the wee hours of the night, we ask ourselves, really? Did we? Were we, you know? So we seek to console ourselves with languages of consolation which we suspect are a lie, or we fear are a lie. And so very often the struggle to console ourselves for failure or defeat can take a very, very long time.
Here's a curious thought that just comes to my head. We live in societies that are so unused to the need for consolation. I find it in my work, if I talk to people and I can't offer them, you know, a sort of a continuation of the progress narrative, the reactions are quite often disappointed and a little bit aggressive.
Yes.
Because people expect that our idea of history, very deeply ingrained,
Yes.
is progress, is tomorrow will be better than today.
Yes.
And that is
And it's not just
individual and it's collective progress.
Yeah, it's not just a narrative about history with a capital H, it's a narrative about your life.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
But it means, you know, if you say this society will fail individually, will eventually, and at some point we'll all be dead.
Yeah.
In the meantime, there is a life to be had,
Yeah.
but there is no great goal to reach, no apotheosis to achieve here.
Yeah.
People are very uncomfortable with that thought. Why are we so uncomfortable with the thought that eventually we will fail in this life?
Yeah. Deep questions here, and hard
It's
to
your
figure
fault.
out.
You wrote the book.
I mean, I think we're very invested in narratives and have been invested in those narratives for 200-300 years. We began to see in the 16th, 17th century two facts. One of them was growing numbers of people who simply didn't believe in the promise of Christian salvation. They just didn't believe there was paradise on the other side of life. And it starts with very few people, then gradually it becomes more and more widespread. And that then means that your life has to be made in this life. And you can't console yourself for this life by imagining another life. There's only this life. That's what we call secularization. And I think that's behind a lot of this story. Just the slow collapse of a narrative of salvation. There will be people watching this, I hope, who disagree with me, who think, I still believe in it. Fine, good, I respect that. I don't want to cast aspersions on it. I'm just saying, as a historical fact, there are fewer who believe in the promise of salvation, and therefore fewer who believe in that kind of consolation. The second thing that then began to happen around the same time was we began to make technical progress of an irreversible kind. There's no question that we began to find out things about the universe that were proven true. We began to produce machines and produce forms of prosperity that were irreversible. And at that point, we begin to get exactly what you say, a narrative of progress. And pretty soon, the intellectuals went to work on the facts of progress and turned it into a narrative of progress. And we've been living with it ever since. And many people see that as the secular alternative to the promise of paradise that used to be in religion. We now have a secularized idea that history can be redemptive in the sense that we can move from poverty and backwardness and squalor and ignorance towards ever greater mastery of nature. Well, I think one of the things that narrative of progress was, I think, sustained the confidence of bourgeois society in the West for 200 years.
But that's very interesting, because that means that this progress narrative is, as you describe it, a sort of secularized religion. Mm-hmm. It hasn't replaced religion, but effectively it is the same content in different garb. But that means that still doesn't equip us to deal with situations.
No, it doesn't. And the progress narrative is secularized religion in one sense, but it absolutely doesn't have what religion did have, which was a specific consolation for painful loss. To bring this home, the narrative of scientific progress would mean absolutely nothing to you, Philip, if you lost your son or daughter to an illness. The fact that there has been massive medical progress over the last 200 years wouldn't mean a damn thing to you if your son or daughter died of some illness that medicine was unable to fix. You don't care what the big narrative is. All you know is you don't have a son alive. And so the narrative of progress never connected to the moments where we need consolation and meaning, which is when we suffer loss. So there was always something ideological about this idea of progress. And there's some other problems with it too, namely that we thought for a long time that science was the solution to all our problems, and now we know, to a degree we didn't know even 60 years ago, that scientific and technical progress are also part of the driving force that has been destroying the environment. And then, so it's no longer the solution, it's intricately part of the problem that we have with imagining any kind of historical future for ourselves. So where are we? We're in a situation where the religious languages of consolation no longer persuade or convince. The scientific story of progress leaves us bereft when we face personal tragedy. And that big grand narrative is also running up against the environmental limits that we're all. So we're in a bit of a mess here.
In this mess, you've done something that people in generations before us have also done, which is to turn back to people in history who have also thought about that. And this is effectively a series of portrait of friends that you talk to throughout the centuries. I'm interested in the non-Christian friends. Have they got anything to offer us or to offer you in this conversation that Christianity doesn't?
I think they do. I mean, the book starts with some Christian and religious sources. What I'm interested about them, in fact, is how doubting, how anguished, how agonized they are. You know, I read St. Paul not as a triumphant, Paul's epistles are not a triumphant celebration of the imminent coming of the Lord, but a much more anguished struggle with the fact that, the Messiah isn't coming here, folks. What do we do? So I hope I breathed life into some of these religious texts simply by reconnecting to the doubts and anguish that they try and express. At the same time, the book is also an attempt to do justice to those who rebel against a religious consolation. The most prominent, famous example of that, I guess, is David Hume in the middle of the 18th century, who basically says, this stuff just doesn't work. It doesn't survive philosophical scrutiny. If you believe in miracles, it takes a miracle to believe in miracles. I mean, this kind of stuff. Tremendously destructive pounding of the religious narrative. And it's out of that people begin to generate this secular narrative of progress to take its place. But one of the things that both David Hume says, and then Condorcet says, and then Marx says, is one of the greatest obstacles to making this world a better place are our projected desires for paradise in another place. We have to bring our longings for a better world back to this world and build a better world here. Every bit of socialism, Marxism, social democracy, even some of the things I believe in politically, come from, in fact, a rather praiseworthy desire to replace the consolations of religion with the consolations of politics, with, let's build a better world together. So I try to do justice both to the religious traditions of consolation, but also the revolt against them, because we're shaped by both, it seems to me. And in struggling to find what we can use now, we need to use both the religious sources and the anti-religious ones.
You quote one thing by Hume that is perhaps the most wonderful and sunny sentence for anybody afflicted by fear of death, namely Boswell asking him disingenuously, one assumes, whether he's not distraught at the idea of no longer existing.
Yes.
And he says, on the contrary, now I'm more distraught than never not having existed before my birth.
Yes, exactly.
And of course it points out a wonderful fallacy. Nobody has ever lain awake thinking of all the billions of years that you weren't there.
Yes.
And what the world was like without you. But somehow... But you also have a conversation with one friend who's particularly close to my heart, because he seems to say most things that matter in a way that nobody else did at the time, and that's Michel de Montaigne, who finds a very personal kind of consolation that is sort of steeped in antiquity but also entirely new.
Yeah, he is an astonishing figure. I mean, I try to situate him in the middle of a devastating civil war, religious civil war, in the middle of a plague. We forget how desperate the times were. And that makes, I think, Montaigne such a continually inspiring figure, because despite this context, he says, I'm not going to turn back to religious sources of consolation. I'm not going to turn back to even my books. He's one of the most learned men of his times, and everybody knows about Montaigne's towers and the books ranged in a circle in front of his desk, and his love of the Greek and Roman classics. But towards the end of his life, in the late 1580s, he kind of puts the books away and says, when I think honestly about what consoles me about living my life, he says, it's he says it's life itself. It's getting up in the morning. It's having my breakfast. It's going for a ride on horseback. It's having a day when I'm not agonized by kidney stones. It's a well-made bed. It's a glass of wine. It's the company of a friend. It's the common comforting rituals of life. And if you cannot be consoled, he's saying to us very simply, unless you discover in yourself a very passionate love of life as it is right now. And that's a terribly powerful idea. And no one had said it better. And no one said it better since, in a way.
And there's a stunning thing, because in the first bit of advice that we have on how to lead a good life, in the Gilgamesh epos, the last beer bar in the world, the last cocktail bar in the world, Gilgamesh comes there on his quest to defeat death.
Yeah.
And there's a barkeeper, there's the innkeeper of the last bar in the world before the great sea starts, and he goes there for a beer, effectively. And she asks him, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm trying to defeat death. And she says, well, give up now. What's there to life? Wash yourself with water, put on clean clothes, make a feast every day, and to delight in your wife in your arms and your child's hands in yours.
Absolutely.
And that simplicity reminds me very much of Montaigne.
Yeah.
On the other hand, also, Gilgamesh fails. I mean, it's already a journey of consolation because his best friend has died. He sets out to defeat death. He fails in defeating death. And his fate is that he's 2/3 God and 1/3 man. It seems to me that our need for consolation comes from the fact that we can't shake that 1/3 man in the Christian tradition. It's about redeeming ourselves from our humanity.
Yes.
In Montaigne, it's finding it in our humanity.
Yes.
It's a very radically different direction.
Yes. Yeah, and I end up being pretty passionately convinced by that love of the flesh, that love of the ordinary and humble pleasures of life. Montaigne is a hinge moment in the book, in some way, because it provoked controversy with some of my friends. They said, you've forgotten the Montaigne who actually dies taking Catholic final unction. You know, I mean, he dies in the faith. Not in the essays, he doesn't. No. In the essays, it seems to me he's very, very. Part of I think also is a sense of a charitableness towards human fallibility, which is terribly important because we beat ourselves up a lot, and we should, because it's very hard to be truthful about ourselves. And Montaigne understands that struggle almost better than anybody I know. And I think being reconciled to yourself.
I mean, he was a fideist. He was attached to rituals and practices. He couldn't have had a decent burial without that ritual.
Yes.
He had a family.
Yes.
I presume that wasn't worth the symbolic act for him, to leave all these people behind unconsoled and himself unburied.
Absolutely. He was thinking of others. Yeah.
But, I mean, you know, a little bit like Diderot, who moves into the parish, the only parish, Saint-Roch in Paris, that will bury unrespectable people like actors and philosophers.
Yes, yes.
And as an old man, he moves there because his wife is deeply Catholic and he knows that otherwise...
and he's buried there, and then they dig him up 10 years later.
They dig him up and churn him around, and that's... and if I went to that church, and the priest still denied that he was there, which was very interesting. I had a camera crew with me, so... But he said, no, it's not. We've got lovely people like André Le Nôtre, but people like that, never heard.
We're the heirs of all these people. I think one of the messages of the books, I can see you feel it, is this sense that these are not kind of distant intellectual figures off the shelves. There's some...
No, but you do a beautiful job of placing them in their historical environments. in the circumstances of their lives, in the agony of their lives very often. I'm always astonished how little people, even historians, read things historically.
Yeah.
Read things from the circumstances of people's lives, from the circumstances of being able to write a certain book or not.
Yeah, I tried to make these biographical essays because I didn't want this to be, mongering a lot of doctrine, one text after another. I'm much more interested in the lives, in a way, than I am in the doctrines, for a reason which I think relates to consolation. I say somewhere that we're consoled by people, not by doctrines, in my view. It's real people in real time who either console us or who don't. And I wanted to restore these people to their biographies so people could see, as I said earlier about Montaigne, that this is a man not writing in an ivory tower. He's writing in the middle of a plague where, people are dying in the fields right out his window, and that sense of, I think helps us to restore a connection to them. Part of the business of history is the constant struggle to save these people from forgetting and loss. You want to kind of keep them alive, and I think that's what I was trying to do in this book.
Let's keep them alive by jumping into the present, a time that certainly has its own need of consolation. And let me start with not the Ukraine war, but with a whole generation of young people that I know, and I'm sure you, who are effectively despairing. Young, well-educated kids around, say, between 16 or 14 and 30, who think, actually, it's over. No point anymore. Climate catastrophe will overwhelm us all. Why should we live? What do you answer them?
Well, the part of me that was once a father, and I'm still a father, wants to shake them, just, father to son, father to daughter, come on, because I'm threatened by their despair. I'm frankly alarmed by it. I'm angry about it as well, in some way, so I see it very personally as two generations talking, and I feel, I'm in my 70s now, and I'm pretty heavily invested in the idea that we are going on. This is continuing, and it's up to you. It's not up to me anymore. We've done a fair bit of screwing up about this, although the guilt that my generation has, I think, is tremendously overdone, frankly, without giving us any alibis. The thing I feel, for example, about the environment is that we know more about the environment. When I date back to the beginning of my environmental awareness, which was Earth Day 1970, I remember it vividly as if it was yesterday, seeing for the first time that picture of the globe as seen from space, and everybody had that sudden sense of, this is our home, this is the only one we've got. That very visceral sense I've had ever since. If you then track the knowledge that a global population now has about the systemic interactions that environmental science has revealed to us about the climate, about the ocean systems, all of the systems that make human life or life on the planet possible. We didn't know anything in 1970. In 2022, we know something. That has to count for something. It is absolutely true that we haven't moved fast enough. We plead guilty to all that. But the knowledge revolution here has to matter. Is that consoling? I don't want it to be consoling. I want it to be energizing. I don't want us to sit here and think, well, we didn't do as badly as we thought. No, I want us to sense the urgency of the moment. But you can't get anywhere if you don't acknowledge the knowledge revolution, number one. And number two, that one of the things again, speaking to the despair, is when a very brilliant and charismatic teenager says of a climate change discussion that it's all just blah, 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 she's saying much more than I think she's aware of. What she's saying is the endless process of democratic deliberation is a waste of time, because there's only one thing that matters, namely the end of the world. And if you don't understand that, you're just talking. I don't agree, because this is, or we are, in a democracy. And in a democracy, that's what you do. You talk. There's a lot of blah, blah, blah in a democracy. But without the blah, 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 we can't do anything. You prefer to have a dictator tell us what our climate goals are and impose them? Fine, you go ahead. But not me. So I'm saying two things to the despair. Remember the knowledge revolution, and don't give up on democratic deliberation. I don't make any promise beyond that, and I'm as alarmed as everybody is by what I know and what the knowledge is telling me. But is this consoling? I don't know. I don't think there's anything consoling about the environmental situation. But I'm absolutely convinced that despair is the wrong way to go. Consolation, I keep saying in this book, is about how we find hope after loss, after reverse, after suffering, the hope to go on. I don't mean hope in the celestial, grand, historical sense. I just mean literally the hope to put the next step after the other. And that hope we really need in relation to the environment.
Where does it come from?
It comes from knowledge, and it comes from faith in our fellow citizens. It comes from presenting to them the facts over and over and over again with infinite amounts of blah, blah, blah. And finally, the penny drops. It also depends on leadership. It depends on people seizing a moment like our insane dependency on, for example, Russian fuels that come from dictatorships, not just in Russia, but also in the Gulf states.
Fuels have a habit of coming from dictatorships.
We have tied democracies in chains to tyrants because of our dependence on fossil fuels. Well, this is, as they say, a teachable moment. Dependence on leadership to seize that. I think it's fatuous to tell 18-year-olds, cheer up, stop being despairing, here are the facts, just move on. And I don't want to console anybody, but I do think that consolation is about not giving up.
One other situation, I think, where consolation is perhaps not so obvious, but I think in a way more needed, because the climate crisis has to do with activism, and being active is always one form of therapy. But what we've seen, people of our age, is sort of the breakdown of the great liberal narrative of we knew that the West was freer and better and wealthier than the East. We knew that the West had won. Mm-hmm. We knew that it was an essentially virtuous system that had won. That it was rich and peaceful because we were punctual and we worked hard and we were democratic and transparent. We had sort of edited out the bits where we had slaves and destroyed large swathes of environment and terribly exploited workers in our own country. All of those things had vanished from this narrative. It is now back. We have now understood that the great liberal narrative was never quite as bright and lightful as we imagined it to be, and it's left a hole. Mm-hmm. It's left a hole of a direction to go into for society. Mm-hmm. It's left a hole of also, in a secularized way, something to believe in. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How is consolation possible in a moment of that when basically whole generations lose their way of seeing the world?
Well, if again you see it through the lens of thinking about consolation, I think it's always better to discard false consolations, even if it leads you without consolation, if it leaves you inconsolable. Our need for consoling narrative, for consoling rhetoric, it seems to me, is just what distinguishes us as human beings. I think we're people who depend tremendously on a symbolic frame in which gives meanings to our actions, both as individuals and as a group. Cats and dogs, I don't think, need a symbolic frame, but we emphatically do. And the other feature of these symbolic frames is that we test these frames against reality, and when they fail to measure up, we go through a crisis and we discard them and then begin to put some other scaffolding up. The liberal narrative was constructed in a battle against absolutism and tyranny and poverty and backwardness, and it was a narrative of hope. But it was also, as you point out, a narrative which consigned a lot of disagreeable facts to silence. Slavery, for one. Racism, for another. Environmental despoliation, for another. We're waking up to the fact that we built a narrative on things that denied realities that we have to face. So we have to wake up. And we have to put in place, I think, a new story. But I just think that's been going on for a very long time. The idea that there was a sort of fatuous, self-satisfied liberal narrative never struck me as being right. The characteristic of liberal narrative, in fact, has been constantly self-questioning the points at which it doesn't correspond to reality. I mean, liberals were among some of the strongest critics of slavery, colonialism, empire, and not just liberals, socialists, social democrats, also some conservatives. The thing about modernity is we have these narratives and then we spend our time complaining about them, saying they're not true, saying they don't fit, saying this and that and the other. That democratic ferment means that we don't sit in a kind of echo chamber of our own faith. We live in a constant questioning. And that seems to me to be, and people don't like that. People think, oh, can't we get back to the eternal verities? Forget about it. This is modernity. You don't like the heat, get out of the kitchen. Really, we have to then reinvent these narratives that say we can't build prosperity for all at the cost of destroying the planet. That's simple. That's intuitively clear to everybody. So we have to change what we do. We have to invent the technologies. We have to do the things that allow us to make human life survive on the planet. Right? That's not hard. It's infinitely hard, but the principle is clear enough. We have to stop considering white people superior to other races. We've got to stop thinking that men are superior to women. Just get this stuff done, and we're in the middle of doing it. This has been the revolution that I've lived through in my lifetime. I'm now in my 70s. It's someone else's job pretty soon, but it goes on. It doesn't stop.
Is that the consolation?
I think so, in the sense that what I think is not consoling, but persistently interesting, is that narratives that lie about who we are, and narratives that don't tell the truth about what is plainly in front of people's eyes, Cease to convince them. I am a believer in you can fool the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. I just am. That's the rationalist in me. I don't think social media has changed that either, by the way. I think when the narratives break down, it's a good thing, not a bad thing. But we cannot live without narrative, because we cannot live without hope, and it's narratives that give us hope. And that's, to that degree, this is the connection with consolation.
I was wondering whether narratives don't also contribute to our consolation because they do something else. Namely, they give us a sense that our expectation of order and justice in the world can be in some way it can be justified. The world in which we live is clearly chaotic, and senseless things happen all the time. Our good efforts are not rewarded. Things come on our way without us having done any work, and when we're almost there, we get sick and everything becomes impossible. We need stories, because otherwise it wouldn't be worth getting up in the morning. If
Indeed.
you know that there's another meaningless day in front of you in which all sorts of things could happen, then staying in bed may be the best strategy. But effectively we fool ourselves with ideas that this reality has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yes.
It has a dynamic development. At the end are reward and punishment. Things have predictable outcomes, which are all empirically false, effectively. But without it, we would be unconsoled. We would not be able to function.
Yeah. Well, there's no question we cannot live without a belief that our world makes sense, that there is order, that there is meaning, that there is purpose, even if we can't see it. We are storytellers by necessity, not just to have fun, but to give ourselves the orientation in the world that we need, so we don't jump off a bridge and we can go on. Consolation is integrally in it's storytelling.
It's sort of necessary when the story stops, when the story gets broken.
Yes, and when the story breaks, we have to invent a new story. And we're in the middle of a huge rewriting of the story. I think we do have a feeling that the post-war narrative that developed from, say, 45 to the mid-60s, early 70s, as I came of age, was a story of, rebuilding after the war, the prosperity, the inclusion, the social democratic, what the French call les 30 glorieuses. From the 70s onwards, we've been in a new world. And since 2000, perhaps since 9/11, we've been in a much more brutal and violent and frightening world. And nobody can see the pattern in the carpet. Nobody can see how this works. But I don't despair in the slightest. It seems to me we're all working at producing these visions that give us clarity about where we came from, where we're going, why our life has meaning. And it has meaning for us to the degree that we can make our world more just, more fair, less brutal, more sustainable. I mean, these are simple things that I think many people believe. These are the purposes that the narrative serves. These are the things we're trying to achieve. I keep coming back to your point about the despair of 16-year-olds, and I want to grab these kids. I want to talk to them. I want to convince them, hang in there, don't give up.
Michael, that's just about the nicest way to end this conversation. So thank you for being our guest.
My pleasure. My pleasure.